So you're aware. Then I need a computer and an adapter, and then we're good. So then plenty of charge, so that's all fine. Maybe it does actually make more sense if I all right. So displays.
Is it working?
It's all good. I think it's coming. Wait, I need to just do some setup on the monitor. Wait. Right, so that. What are we in there? HDMI 1. Okay. Almost ready. Right. Okay. So that is all ready to go. All right. All right. So.
Praise. Assessing the aces. Goodness me, that's an amazing coincidence. Great. Because I mean, this is something people externally interested in. Yeah. So are you also like interested in the project? I'm more interested in the sustainable finance. You organize events. Okay. I have to confess I haven't heard of it before. Sustainable finance. I'm sorry. That's great.
So.
Yeah. Sure. I can give you for us for that. Yes.
Okay, so
Would you like some?
I'm all good. Everything's fine. So all ready to go. Right. So
She was there. I thought I shouldn't gate crash even though people told me it was okay, but she was there. Unfortunately, I didn't.
Wait, so what did you guys move this year? Buildings?
2 weeks ago, I started.
Oh, yeah.
So this is what we do. This is like a non-profit project that's been running for several years.
Yeah.
If you want to ask questions of state institutions. Yeah.
Really? Why?
I mean, like, super.
Yeah.
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 And we are just trying to promote finance. So we go to every single person, collaboration from the business, government. In the company, they build your so this income is given very both that I think is that both that the other session right.
All good. This is officially called Prague Creative Center.
Yes.
Creativity Center.
Creativity Center.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's similar.
Yeah, okay. Creative.
At the time, the marketing was under Akimova.
Yeah, under Akimova. Yeah.
But
No, sorry.
Prague Creative Center.
Prague
Right.
Creative
Yeah.
Center.
Okay.
division.
All right.
And also center ER.
Okay. Right.
For some reason.
September 2002, they announced that they are going from the Czech market.
Yeah.
But it was the Czech market, it was also
Right.
another 20
Central Europe. Yeah.
Besides Central Europe, there was also Japan and
Yeah.
Guatemala.
Yeah,
It was unique experience,
Yeah.
going through this transition,
Yeah.
the new business being sold, and me, was shifted from last they bought us, they bought our portfolio, so on and something in place. So I just remained to the very last day, just to make sure that the transition.
All right. We're all good. We're ready to go.
Very low and stuff. It was fun. I stayed in Represent for another 3 years.
Did you? Okay. In marketing, yeah.
Polish and so I stayed there for 3 years, and now I'm much more business.
Yeah, sure.
And we introduced through
All right.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused because there were a bunch of people who said on Twitter that they were definitely coming by, but so far didn't comment. So I don't know what's going on.
So maybe just run around the building.
Yeah, see, I've also done posted on Twitter where we are. So yeah, have a quick look and see if you can find people who are searching. But then we'll start in 5 minutes. And I know that 2 are late because they've said so.
She just children's passing by.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I just started following him on Twitter. So I did about a year ago. I was always interested in railways from the beginning. And in fact, in London, before I came to Prague, I was 5 years on the top advertising national railways. Some kind of professionals. It was a long time.
People find it as quite interesting business.
Yeah, absolutely. Though I still don't understand, when I was there, it was still national. It was just like, well, we're getting ready for the price. Since then, I didn't have any direct contact. I'm trying to learn off these guys and see where
It's extremely interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Quite,
Help yourself, some refreshing.
yeah, but I don't want to be the first to.
Let's go together. Let's go together.
You know,
Okay. Air quality is good also. I have a CO2 meter with me here to measure the quality of the air, and in the train coming to Prague it was really bad. Here with the open windows it's really good. It might be hot, but the quality of the air is really good. So that's fine. It was quite an important thing to have to know kind of how dangerous is even doing this project during COVID times. So I have a CO2 parts per million meter with me throughout. So I registered in the train earlier on. I registered 1,837 parts per million, which is really high. Whereas here we're only very fractionally above ambient air level. So in here we're healthy. It might be hot, but we're healthy.
yeah, a bit scary. I never thought of that.
But what we don't know is how good the filters are in the train, because some railways have said they've installed filters to filter out potentially filter out any virus. But we obviously, you can't know that. You know? And the experience so far in the trip has been the quality of the air in the trains, if it's an air-conditioned train, varies enormously. Obviously, the fuller the train is, the worse the quality of the air. But some really modern trains are really bad, some really old ones are dreadful, but sometimes actually some quite old ones work quite well. So you have everything in between. So it's been quite interesting to basically to then just, this is like a very basic CO2 meter, it's accurate enough, plus or minus 10%. But to get a bit of a kind of an overview of, to give myself the answer to the question like how dangerous is this where I am just at the moment.
No one seems to be lost in the
Okay, well I've posted on Twitter where it is, and if people message me, I'll. I know that there are 2 people from České dráhy who are on their way, but they're a bit late. Others who messaged me earlier on today, no idea. So let's see. Let's just make a start with who we have, and we will see. Also, there might be some people also following online. I see that there are a couple of people reacting. Okay, right then. Let's make a start then. Everyone in? Right. So a couple of more people are coming, so I don't know quite what's happening where they are. It's also a lunchtime in the middle of the summer, which is not obviously necessarily the easiest time. It's here, right, exactly. So people come, whatever. It's also being recorded. Hello to those people on YouTube. So there are questions will be coming up to later on. Hello, welcome, take a seat. Also, if you wish to pose a question, those people on YouTube, it would probably be best if you can pose that question on Twitter rather than posing it underneath the YouTube film, because simply so I have a kind of an overview of what's going on in terms of numbers and questions here. I know there are also a couple of people from České dráhy who are on their way, but will be here at about 1300. Let's see, people will come and go. So what I'll do first of all is I'm going to show a few slides to explain what my project is about and why I'm doing it, and then we can come into a discussion about any of these different aspects, the politics, the technicalities, anything that you want to talk about cross-border rail in the European Union, then I'm happy to debate and discuss it. And anything I say shall be considered on the record. Well, again, it's streaming on YouTube, so it's got to be on the record, right? So, and if you wish to download the slides, they've also just been tweeted out. I'm happy, it's all Creative Commons license, so feel free to share the slides any way you wish. This is a picture from the Sweden-Finland border. That is the cross-border railway bridge at Tornio-Haparanda. I'm on Sweden. National railway systems in Europe work comparatively well, but once you cross a border on a train, everything becomes more complicated. Infrastructure, service levels, ticketing timetables are all either of poorer quality or are more difficult to accomplish. So that's the crux of the problem, essentially. The moment 2 countries are involved, everything gets, even within the so-called borderless European Union, everything gets more complicated. What then is this project? It is a project to cross all of the internal borders of the European Union that you can cross by train. So I'm not doing external borders of the European Union, so sorry. And there are today's trip day 27, so I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and the main part of the project will conclude on 1st of August. Where there are no trains anymore, I will cross the border by bicycle. So I have a foldable bicycle with me, it's parked down in the yard. So that also allows me to go and investigate the infrastructure at the border and photograph it. So, like, for example, the picture of the Tornio-Haparanda bridge that I just showed, I can cycle to the place where the trains don't run, photograph it, document it, and explain what's going on. And then there are meetings with activists, in as far as I can do them, in every capital city en route. So there's a lot of meetings as well as I go. What are the specific issues? And we kind of discussed this a bit earlier, a little bit over a beer. Basically, there are 4 categories of cross-border railway problems. In some places, like for example, 2 days from now, I'm going to Bad Radkersburg at the border of Austria to Slovenia, where the railway bridge was blown up at the end of World War II by the retreating Nazis, and then has never been rebuilt since. So there are quite some other kind of geopolitical or historical reasons for some of those things missing as well. The second category is tracks exist, but passenger trains don't run, right? So it might be that literally the track exists and nothing runs there, and in some other places that there are goods trains that run, but passenger trains don't run. There is no goods train dimension to this particular project right at the moment. Third, when trains run, the timetables are so poor, no one actually uses the train, right? I explained this story, I don't actually have it in these slides. I was the only passenger on a 3-carriage cross-border train between Mons in Belgium and Aulnoy in France, because that train leaves at 6:04 a.m., so it's designed for no one to take it. Basically, for the Belgian state to say, tick, we have a cross-border train to France, but actually it's not designed in a way that anyone could potentially use the service. And last but not least, informational tickets. Mons in Belgium, there's the total between the two is about 35 kilometers. The red line is on already existing passenger railway, where yellow exists, it's also another passenger railway. The black thin line you can see is a freight railway, and the grey line with a kink in it is what I had to do on a bicycle. So basically, this bit here is freight, that bit there is missing, and this bit here again is then a passenger railway. Now, and that little border bit. Now, so that's the current situation at the border bit, where 2 kilometers of track have fallen into disrepair. Nothing can cross there at the moment. And this is the situation on the Belgian side. So you literally see the overhead wires end literally at the border. That road is the border between the two there. And so nothing can go through here, and nothing has gone through here. You can dump some, there's some buffers there, and dump some gravel on the line there. Now, the irony about this one is the European Union Agency for Railways is based in Valenciennes, right? So they are responsible for improving Europe's railways, and they themselves do not have a cross-border railway line that will connect them up to Brussels. So a lot of their people, crazy though it sounds, live in Belgium and drive to go and work in the European Union Agency for Railways each day. Now, it's been a bone of contention for them over the many years that this cross-border railway there doesn't function. So they actually invited me to come to Valenciennes to see their problem with the 2 kilometers of missing track, the freight line as well, in order to manage to make it workable. So it's comparatively simple and comparatively quick to do, but nevertheless you would need some serious investment in order to manage to make it work. The next one is what happens when there is a cross-border line, but nothing runs on it. Now, the situation at this one has marginally changed since I was there. This is the so-called most dangerous place in the European Union at the moment, the Suwałki Gap. So the little bit of the Poland-Lithuania border, which is sandwiched between Kaliningrad on one side and Belarus on the other side. There is one cross-border railway which crosses through that gap. Now, when I went there, I had to do that whole piece, 82 kilometers, by bicycle, because trains run as far as Mariupol on the Lithuanian side and begin again at Suwałki on the Polish side. Now, what subsequently happened since I was there, they've reintroduced a very minimal service, 2 trains per week on this line, right, just at weekends, which is nevertheless not a particularly decent or solid service offer. Now, what then becomes very interesting when you start observing these types of situations is what happens if one side of the border wants to fix things and the other side of the border doesn't. So this is the infrastructure on the Lithuanian side. They've built new underpasses to replace level crossings. They've laid new track. They've indeed got new transshipment spots for the freight. They've laid even dual gauge track on one particular spot of the border and put in place sound reduction measures at each of the villages. Like, everything is in a comparatively good condition. Get to the other side, and that's the Polish track. You can see it's still bolted together here rather than welded. And all of the level crossings all look something like that, right, without even barriers. You can go at a maximum speed of about 50 kilometers an hour only on the line on this side. So basically what you see here is a cross-border line where there is a strong incentive on one side of the border, the Lithuanian side, to fix it, but there is little to no political will on the Polish side to want to really fix this. And theoretically in the European Union, Rail Baltica is probably the worst example of it, right? Where essentially the European Union has a major project to connect all of the Baltic states to Poland with a standard gauge railway. But what then happens is until that is complete, sometime probably between 2027 and 2030, you leave the existing infrastructure largely to rot in the interim period and don't let anything run there. So that's the second case. That's via through Monaco and Ventimiglia. So just at the border section is where it all breaks down. So a work case. So if you want to go from Marseille to Genova by train, these are the timetables. You depart on the 7:57 a.m. train from Marseille to Nice. Gets you there at 10:41. Not super fast, but it works. But the problem is when you get to Nice, the train to the border station Ventimiglia has departed 5 minutes earlier. Right? So you can't take that one. So instead you have to take this one at 11:06 instead, so half an hour later. The problem then, when you then get to the border station at Ventimiglia, you again miss it with only a 4-minute miss for the connecting train. And Torino, there you have comparatively good long-distance journeys, but if you live in one of the small towns either side of the border, then you're basically stuck. All of the regional trains on the French side stop at Modane, the final station on the French side, and all of the Italian regional trains only start at Bardonecchia, which is the first station on the Italian side, on the other side of the tunnel. And although Italian trains could run the whole way through to Modane without any technical limit, it doesn't happen because the Italians have no interest and the French don't have a suitable train. Right? Now, if this were a line within one country of the European Union, you would have solved that long ago. Right? So these are very simple changes, and indeed that valley is comparatively densely populated. You could easily have a cross-border regional service here for very little money, and there is no technical hurdle preventing you from doing so. And last but I discovered, actually amusingly, because this is a European Union project, concerns Strasbourg, one of the seats of the European Parliament. So if I put into Deutsche Bahn's search Berlin, where I live, to Strasbourg, and it routes me onto this little regional train which goes from Offenburg, just a short hop across the border, to Strasbourg, Deutsche Bahn will give me a price of 129 euros for a single fare. If, however, I ticket bit for just 4 euros in the train and complete the journey for less than a third of the price if I know the trick. Right? Now, these types of tariff problems exist all over the place, where essentially what has basically happened is no one has thought to include the stop Strasbourg in Deutsche Bahn's local tariff system. Right? Now, it's quite amusing to me that the seat of the European Parliament still has not managed to ultimately find a solution to that sort of problem. More data for ticketing in their system than any of the others. But the problem is they send you on some really peculiar routes because they basically send you places, rather than saying, here is a train, we can't sell you the ticket for it because the railways won't give us the data. They send you on whatever might not be the most logical route to get to your destination, right? That normally means Paris to Bilbao goes via Barcelona, which you probably don't want to do. You probably want to go via Hendaye instead. So that's then the crux of the issue, why ultimately those platforms so far do not work.
Intentionally pick the bad ones, or did you go through some good ones, and can you learn something from the good ones?
Yep. So it was a very kind of iterative process to work out which borders to choose, right? And depending upon the pair of countries, sometimes I had very little to choose. Project. Some cross-border connections where you go, nothing can change here, right? So the border I took between Germany and Denmark, so from Nibel to Tönner, which is the smallest of the cross-border lines, basically connects completely empty areas in both sides of the border. It's a single track line, it's only diesel, but considering no one lives there, it's about as good, sorry if you live in Nibel and Tönner and you're following on the live stream, basically it is the best you could ever get given the nature of the population in that region, right? There is no market for more. And so for that, I can basically say, this is as good as you can get, and I'm happy with that. Now, to answer your question more widely, I basically wanted to make sure I had a selection in my project of all of the different things. Places where the tracks were in disrepair, places where there were tracks but no trains, places where there were timetable problems, and places where there were ticketing problems. And I tried to manage to achieve a kind of selection of all of those different ones within the project. And different people came to me and said, we'd really like you to go and visit this border. This is particularly interesting, so go there. And so I tried to kind of integrate as many suggestions that came from all of the kind of people who were commenting online about the project. You had a second question?
Yes. One is about ticketing. My experience is that when it's two countries, it usually works. At least here in Czechia, you can pretty much get tickets far.
You can, yeah.
Even to Geneva, one ticket. But once you want to cross two countries from your original country, it's pretty much impossible. You can't really buy, or if you can buy, it's extremely expensive. So I got a ticket from Prague to Rome, but I cannot get a connecting ticket to Naples, for example.
Right.
And so to me, it seems there is it works when it's two countries, but it doesn't work like across the continent. So is it that that's where the EU should step in the most?
Yeah, partly. Yes, but you live in one of the very best countries for handling that issue, right? Because basically, Czechia, Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, simply put, those railways have solid working relationships with most of their neighbours. Not all of their neighbours, but most of their neighbours. So booking from here to any neighbouring country, it works. So if you go to Poland and you're not going to a big city, but you're going to a small town served only by a regional train, there that might not in all circumstances work. It depends upon the region. Now, and the nightmare is if you cross somewhere into France, basically from anywhere into France, and you're not going to a big city, you can basically forget it. Now, there are, in my view, two ways you could solve that problem. One would be place an obligation on railway companies to book from Prague the whole way to Lisbon or something. The technical complexity would be enormous. And having seen some pretty horrible IT infrastructures of railway companies as I go over the course of this project, I'm not sure the IT departments of many railways would be very well capable of doing that. What I would instead prefer would be a kind of guarantee in the case of something goes wrong system that basically says if you book to Naples and it takes you 3 tickets, but your journey is acceptable, right? You left yourself enough time to change trains in Roma Termini or in, I don't know, in Munich or whichever way you were going, and then something goes wrong, the railways further down the chain would still be obliged to take you. Right? Now, that would be the ideal solution. Now, that was proposed in a reform at European Union level, but the European Parliament messed up that reform. It was a Polish rapporteur in the European Parliament who listened to Polish railways and said, so it can completely collaborate with each other. So your point is correct, but you are lucky to be living in one of the very best countries in Europe for that.
So speaking of regional differences, you mentioned France was not the best. Here the central sort of European, do you see any other particular regional differences, like maybe caused by political tensions between the countries in Europe, in the EU?
So there's a kind of Central European versus Southwestern European split of some sort. The attitude of what is the railway for in those countries, and what are the type of people that would take it, right? Here's a railway which is taken by pretty much anyone in your team, right? South of Dresden, right? Town of 45,000 people, 50,000 people, right? You arrive in Decim and the trains are departing in every direction with incredible regularity, right? Into all of the villages and the small towns around. They might be old, they might be slow, but they run, and different types of people take them. There are mountain bikers going out to take their bicycle on the train out in the countryside. There are grandparents with the grandchildren, right? Try that in a French regional station, doesn't work. The timetable doesn't work, so you haven't got a train which is so regular. Basically, the only people taking regional trains in France, outside, forget Paris, but in the rest of the regions, are the people who are too poor to have any other option, or they're too young, so they don't have a driving license. And the whole regional train system is organized on that basis. Right? So I spend a lot of time in rural France in Burgundy, and there is a gap of 4 hours in the middle of the day when no regional trains run from the local station. Right? Now, in Czechia, basically you would say either we have no trains on the line, or we have a train at least every 2 hours on the line. Right? It's a completely different take. The Spanish today inaugurated a new high-speed line that goes from Madrid to Badajoz on the border towards Portugal, and they run 2 high-speed trains a day on this line. Right? The Czechs, if they built a high-speed line, they'd run 2 trains an hour on that line. Right? Now, there's a complete different mentality and different take on it. Or last year I was on the border on the really slow train from Budapest to Kelebia on the border to Serbia, towards Subotica. The train was ancient. It was probably from the 60s. It had like sort of plastic strange padded seats, no air conditioning. It was boiling hot, but all kinds of people were taking it. Right? It's a completely different take on what a railway is for and who it is for. And that then to me is central to basically say, and that's also why partly why I have a bicycle with me, this becomes a quasi-ideological point. How do I live a self-directed life the way I want to live it without needing a car? Now, that basically means bicycle to the railway station, a regular good timetable on the train, and a bicycle or a bus on the other end. Right? Now, that works in Czechia, it works in Germany, it works in Austria. Now, okay, there are problems. Sometimes the trains are a bit old, or sometimes they're a bit unreliable, whatever. Yeah, don't get me wrong, it's not paradise. But you can basically say, in those railways, I can live my life. The trains are for the rich people who also have a car and they will drive to the railway station. And the regional trains are for the poor people who have no alternative because either they can't afford a car or they're too young to be able to drive one. And that to me is a complete error in terms of planning of how you structure your railway system. Now, what then happens, right? Oh, and also another thing which I really dislike is trains with compulsory reservation. Right? So I needed a train across Spain in this project from Zaragoza to Vigo, across the whole of northern Spain. The train runs once a day and it is booked out 2 weeks in advance. So the Spanish railways surely go, great, we have 100% occupancy on our train, right? Which probably for the bottom line with their accountants is a really good outcome. But for me that basically says, hey, if I had to go, I don't know, imagine I need to get to a funeral in Vigo and I live in Zaragoza, I basically can't do it because my plans can't change. Because basically I have only one City Express were full. I might have a regional train or an intercity or something else, right? The same in Czechia. If the intercity is full, I have a regional train or 2 or 3 regional trains I could take. So basically, Central European railway networks can better cope with changes in your life than West or Southwestern European railway networks can. And so that's why I'm a big fan of what is done here largely. Because it gives you more kind of ability for kind of self-direction, essentially. And that's not, and cross-border somewhat as well, right? There are cross-border lines with a train once an hour between Germany and Czechia, which allow you to mean you can live on one side and work on the other side of the border. Go for it.
Let me contradict here a little bit. I think in Czechia we having a lot of experience with our trains. I know that your comparison probably is a bit different, but what I'm seeing and the argument that I find hard to tackle is financially wise. If you travel somewhere in 2 people, it's comparable with car, for example. Even with, well, now it might be a bit more financially beneficial due to the high petrol prices or oil prices, but still it's somewhat the same. And to me it's sometimes quite difficult to persuade people to travel somewhere by train, which is less convenient, less comfortable, with the same price if they travel in 2 people.
And especially in cross-border, we were actually discussing that today, the team. So our colleague here is going to Berlin. In Berlin. So Berlin returned from Prague, which is a very, straightforward journey. Obviously, the one train, no changes, and I think it's like 100 euros nearly, right? And it's only a 3-hour drive. So if it's, let's say that a young couple goes to Berlin, it's 200 euros for the journey. So I feel like it's still a big elephant in the room is the price as well.
Sort of. So there's a big argument in railways about should you basically pay exactly the same price regardless of the time of day, right? You have a fixed price of whatever, 25 euros from Prague to Ostrava, regardless of whether I go now or whether I go 2 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now. Or whether you do what you do in Germany, which is basically you give massively reduced fares if people book ahead. Right? So you can get from Berlin to Basel for 17 euros, right? If you book ahead, right? Now, so if I look at within Germany I'll come to you at the shore, the train is going to be damned expensive, but the plane is also going to be damned expensive. Now, the problem when comparing with a car is I've got sunk costs, having bought it, insured it, trained myself to drive it, whatever, and once I've sunk all of those costs, the cost of the individual trip is therefore going to be comparatively low, right? Now, so you've got to put those things into the calculation. Now, a very important point out of this project, although I didn't say it explicitly, is this project is trying to improve railways on their own terms. How can railways become better? Now, railways offering a cheaper price to better allow more different types of people to take them is one component of that. What I'm not doing in this project is basically trying to make plane or car versus train comparisons. Because what I hear from lobbyists of the railway industry in Brussels all the time is, we can't do anything because planes don't pay tax on kerosene, Flixbus doesn't pay charges to use the Autobahn in Germany, so there's nothing we can do. Right? Now, there are actually plenty of things that railways on their own terms, and that. Now, what compensation you get, how much it is determined by the European Union. So there are standard minimum rules which apply EU-wide, which is stipulated by the EU. Right? Now, I would be in favour, if that would mean passengers were better protected, to sort that out better. If it meant basically that Deutsche Bahn was causing more delays than Český dráhy was, and you needed a better system of financial compensation, and that would help passengers, and you needed to revise that whole system, I'd be totally in favour of that. Now, the one that strikes me as the most pernicious is not that one, because basically Český dráhy's relation is complicated enough to mean that many passengers don't bother, and as a result of that, then I assume that then when eventually in some office somewhere for each railway, actually processing those compensation claims should be comparatively easy. But I got a really interesting one. I was on a Spanish train in this project, which was part cancelled due to a French strike, but my ticket was issued by Deutsche Bahn. So get your head around that one, right? I'm going to try and get the compensation on Deutsche Bahn, and we'll see if that works. But that's to do once I'm done with the project. So you do end up with some pretty complicated circumstances. But if you want to say more, or anyone else on that point, but that's my understanding.
Well, regarding this, what I find very weird is that if I book a ticket from Czechia, it's often, like, for example, if you go to Geneva on the sleeper, it's cheaper to go there from Prague than from Zurich to Geneva.
Yeah.
And why and how that happens, that's a mystery.
So
it's yield management actually.
Yeah.
It's an aviation system applied by actually the customers asked for this system from the aviation to be taken anywhere in the transportation system. So this is the logic. But
you can then sometimes play with that as a passenger, right? Exactly in those routes to Switzerland. But the craziest of all is Munich, Vienna, Budapest, where each of the three companies has a contingent of tickets. So on the same train, depending on which website you look, you can get from 20 euros to 120 euros for the same seat. Now, that's also a reason in response to the question about booking platforms. If Deutsche Bahn, ÖBB and MAV all gave their data to Trainline or an equivalent, then you'd have a more organized yield management system. All right. Now, so at the moment, if you find those tricks, you can get a crazy cheap price. All right. There's indeed a whole guide on my blog of exactly how to do it for loads of connections through Germany. But particularly to Switzerland and particularly to Denmark, if you book from the last station in Germany, you often save yourself massive amounts of money in comparison to booking just within one country. It's less crazy in the situation in Czechia.
For travel hacking.
Sorry?
Is it a part of travel hacking?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I'm just checking on Twitter to see if there are questions which came in. Far away.
Here.
Go for it. Rail freight and passenger corridors, which are steadily being built. So it's not possible to say it doesn't exist or it will exist. The challenge is twofold. The first is, can you actually get those things built and constructed? So some countries are really, really slow in constructing their bits of the Trans-European Networks system. So for example, Germany is already 30 years delayed completing their bit between Mannheim and the Swiss border at Basel. So how does the EU hold those countries of the European Union to account to make sure they deliver on their bit? Right? Poland, that case as well, that's a Trans-European Networks route, that one where I had to cycle 80 kilometers I showed in the slide, right? How do you hold Poland to account going, hang on a minute, you haven't even done the basic investment in the basic maintenance on the track there, right? The second is how much should you focus on those main corridors? And this is a bit your question as well. Or how much should you focus on secondary networks? So basically meaning there was a controversial case when a tunnel collapsed, no one was injured, but a tunnel collapsed on that route between Mannheim and Basel, meaning that no freight trains could run through there at all. And suddenly everyone was like, shit, how the hell do we reroute the freight trains around there? And there were no secondary lines you could run them onto, because basically those were either single track or in a bad condition or were not electrified, or you couldn't then run onto the French side of the border. So the EU is reflecting on, could it actually finance more secondary lines to help the kind of resilience of the network at the time of moments of disruption? And so that's currently an ongoing debate in the European Union institutions. So what we will not have, and I'm not even sure we even should aim for, is some kind of European or EU-wide railway operator, right? We're still talking of České dráhy or Deutsche Bahn or SNCF or Trenitalia, and what they can do running across a border. I do not have any expectation that 20 years from now we will have the European Drahi, yeah? Or the Société Européenne des Chemins de Fer. That we will instead have more players in the railway market who will be happy to run on other countries' networks. Now, we've already seen that to a greater extent for freight railways than we've seen so far for passenger rail. And there are a couple of cases, like Italian state railways is running on French tracks between Lyon and Paris. Right? Now, that's a very interesting development in European railways of one company saying, actually, we want to get out of our national market and run on the tracks of a neighbor. And they're actually being really successful at it. So maybe České dráhy can start operating between Dresden to Berlin or something on its own footing, or in Bavaria, ideally. Yeah, but that's how I would answer that point. So it's a steady process, not a kind of a one-off project as such. Go for it.
You were talking earlier about how different countries have different just like mindsets about transportation, how for some people trains is like a secondary source. What do you think the next step is in terms of like making trains that first option? Do you think it would be like regulating cars to get more off the road, or do you think it would be like financial investments into trains?
So I tend to favor carrots and not sticks, right? So make the trains better rather than prevent people using something else, right? So there's a very interesting comparison in that regard. It received huge press that France was banning short-haul flights, but only for the very shortest flights. If you could take a train that was 2.5 hours, right, then you could not fly that route. So that basically meant Bordeaux to Paris, Nantes to Paris, and I think Strasbourg to Paris were basically the only three flight routes that got banned, right, or could no longer run. The CO2 reduction from that flight ban, minusculely small, because basically no one was flying those routes already, right? What saved a lot more CO2 was the Germans that did the opposite. They basically connected up high-speed trains to Frankfurt Airport to mean if you want to go from Stuttgart to Singapore, before you would fly from Stuttgart to Frankfurt and fly from Frankfurt to Singapore. Now you take a train from town and you need the next flight, or your flight breaks down and you haven't got the train that you were booked on to get to your destination. That actually saves a lot more CO2 than France's short-haul flight ban, right? Now, so you've got to make sure then that you make the offer for people on rail as good as it can possibly be. Right. Now, you then also need to look perhaps at price structures. How do you manage to make sure that each transport mode pays a fair share of its cost to society in terms of CO2 emissions, noise problems, particulate problems, the other challenges that poses of kind of use of space, for example, within cities? My impression very much in that regard is we are making, and that's also possibly the aim of this project, is we're making more progress on that in our inner cities than we are making progress on that for longer distances, right? If we were here in this square, I don't know how long this square outside the door here has been pedestrianised, but I remember coming to Prague 20 years ago and there were fewer pedestrianised streets than there currently are now. Our market share for bikes, buses, metros and so on in our cities is doing better than improving our public transport or sustainable share of long-distance transport. So we need to make more progress. Worst of both of those worlds, right? You've got neither public service thinking, nor have you got competition, and that leads you, in some of those circumstances, to a very bad outcome. Now, rail's market share on routes like Amsterdam-Paris, Paris-London, Paris-Frankfurt, Paris-Cologne, Paris-Dusseldorf, yeah, should be considerably higher than it is at the moment, but you have neither a public service approach to maximise capacity, nor do you have competition on those routes between different railway operators. So those are the stations with the highest cost to run a train there, right? Which is the terminus in Paris, which has the most capacity, like Ryanair did, right? The fact that Ryanair didn't fly to Frankfurt main airport and it went to Hahn in the middle of nowhere because the landing price at Hahn was cheap and it was expensive at Frankfurt main airport, right? Can you find, now again, I accept that in many cases in Prague main station it won't go, right? But could you find for Paris terminus or station you can stop, Stratford International, yeah, which has never had an international train running there? Right? Now, those are some of the opportunities. So what you've got to say, and I agree with you in my experience, and I'm not a specialist with regard to it in Czechia, right? But I agree that if there is a capacity constraint, I accept that. You need to rebuild. You need to find completely different ways of routing your traffic. Totally. Yeah? And that's why there's the new plan with a high-speed line to build a Prague East station and so on. I get all of that. But there are many places in Europe where that is... it is not the case. And so you've got to ask yourself then, the question is, how do you do that, right? Or again, what times of day that you would run? Does it make sense that you give Flixtrain for next to free, yeah, a super early path, which allows people, it might be unpleasant to take a train at 4 a.m. to go from Berlin to Cologne, right? But if you make the path cheap and you say, okay, it's nicer than taking a bus, okay, yeah? Now, at the margin, there's scope, right? But that's not going to answer all of your problems, yeah? Well, again, France runs double-decker TGVs all round, but doesn't run double-decker TGVs on the line to Brussels because it's had a dispute about whether they're cleared for the Belgian network, right? For the 30 kilometers into Brussels Midi. Now,
There's a problem in Paris as well. They have road tunnels in Gare du Nord.
Yeah, but they run double-deck TGVs in Gare du Nord. Yeah. So that's fine, that's fixed in Gare du Nord. Now, some of those ones, now that's the difficulty for me as a campaigner here, is how do you get to the bottom of what is or is not a legitimate technical problem? Right? Now, can you get a double-deck TGV approved to go into Brussels Midi, or no one ever tried? Right? And And so that then becomes very hard, because my impression on that one, right, for Thales from Brussels to Paris is they want to restrict capacity because that suits them just fine, because it means they can set very high prices, right? Maybe I'm too skeptical, right, or too cynical. Right?
But this is once again the question whether you want to, I mean, they were asked to make a profit,
Yeah.
to stay on the market. This always
Of course.
like two different concepts, whether it should be like publicly driven,
Yeah.
and nobody can imagine that every second tram or subway line is or train set is in a different color, and I'm not allowed to with this ticket to enter it.
Yeah.
So this is something what we really have to think about, what we expect, I mean the Commission also, what we do expect from the railway system in Europe,
Yeah.
whether we want to have a, let's say, European-wide public transport, let's say in this understanding of the let's say city transport,
Yeah.
or we want to have colorful train system which only allowed me to enter the train. For the particular train, I bought flight tickets, train tickets. So these two concepts are simply here, and the Commission started to let's say to disrupt the original one. Well, the railway was completely derelict, obsolete, whatever. It was right, but now we have two completely different concepts, and they don't work together.
Yeah.
Honestly.
No, I agree with that. But my skepticism is, I don't think the European Commissioner for Transport has an answer to that point.
That's it.
Now, what I've learned from my experience putting this project together, and indeed many years of experience working on this as a campaigner, is there are, and this is what makes it hard to answer that question, is there are good and there are bad state companies. And there are good and there are bad. Now, and then it makes it international as well, right? If we take the example of Thales running Brussels to Paris, right? For the French, that's that Belgian thing that runs to Belgium. For the Belgians, it's that thing that runs to Paris and is owned by SNCF. So what the EU Agency for Railways calls that is collective irresponsibility, right? Basically, no one takes the responsibility for it. Right? Or if in France, you take the TGV from Paris to Basel in Switzerland, it costs you a massive extra to just cross into Switzerland. Whereas if you get out in Mulhouse, it costs you half the price, because it's politically inappropriate to charge too much to go to Mulhouse. But go the international route, we don't give a shit. It's on the other side of the border. Yeah? Now, that's then the question for the EU, yeah, and for the European Commissioner for Transport, is to begin to answer some of those types of questions. Now, I'm not trying to answer that big question in this project. What I want to know, and what I want the EU to know, is what is the situation on the ground, and without answering those big questions, how do you solve those practical matters at a given border, at a given time, right? If you wanted to fix Harmont to Weert, this crazy line between Belgium and the Netherlands, right, which would go from Antwerp to Eindhoven, right? There is a freight line that still runs, right, which isn't even used. Yeah? You'd have massive passenger potential, the route is not at the capacity, the lines are electrified on both sides, right? You can even run the Belgian train at half voltage under the Dutch electrification system on the Dutch side, right? The solution is incredibly simple, right? Those are the types of things I'm kind of, maybe my horizon is too low, right? But I'm trying to basically say, hey look, here are some solid practical things without answering those big questions that you could potentially change in terms of infrastructure in a small way, train rolling stock in a small way, right? The line, I didn't have it in my slides, but the line Vigo in Spain to Porto in Portugal is completely electrified and was electrified using EU money, but not on the cross-border section. So the 2 trains a day, the whole way from Vigo to Porto, are diesel, because neither Renfe nor CP owns an electric train that can run on each other's system. Yeah?
But you know what's the problem? We had a very similar situation here in the Czech Republic. We even bought the trains at the EMUs.
Yeah.
From the European co-financing from the South Bohemia region.
Yeah.
It was clear that if we certificate them for Austria,
yeah, you don't get
it would be allowed to operate it across the border.
Yeah.
The thing is, that it was cheaper to buy it only for the Czech electric system.
Yeah.
Because everybody seeks the profitability, and it was not it was in that time not allowed to get a co-financing for the cross-border.
Yeah.
And it's, let's say, for 30 years concreted somehow.
Yeah.
And this is partly the decision of some clerics and the definition of what is capable to be capable, but could be financed.
Yeah.
And I mean, we are doing these are our own mistakes.
Yeah.
We have done.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a problem. And
Totally.
sometimes I do understand that CP and Renfe simply, I mean, for them they have a rolling stock there. They will not have extra money for that because infrastructure is now considered as a per se entity. So no more considering the operation and the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it's simply the lack of coordination, and people simply believe, the clerics believe it will somehow
solve itself, but it doesn't.
Solve itself, yeah. But this is not the case.
I know.
Many cases.
Yeah, I know, all over. So last time I was in Czechia, I was on the EU's Connecting Europe Express, right, coming from Poland, from Krakow. And the Polish railways had their new Pesa manufactured locomotive, which was not even allowed to run to Bohumín. So we took an old Škoda locomotive from the 1970s from Český Drah.
I mean, this is the technical, it's like the car.
Yeah.
Even maybe only the last rubber.
Solution, if the European Commission wanted to do it, right, would be a European rolling stock interoperability fund. It would basically be just in Czechia, and the difference in costs for more electrification systems or more signaling systems to run into Austria is this difference. Pay us the difference, right?
Yeah, that could be the solution, because normally, at least in Czechia and Germany is the same, the regions of Bundesländer, they pay the regional transport.
Yeah.
And it's their decision actually, it's not the railway's decision.
Yeah.
Whether you go or you have to wait 30 years for going.
Right. No, so...
This is sometimes the people do not understand the complexity of the railway system. Unfortunately, it's terrible.
So it's complicated, but it also is capable. You've got a locomotive that can haul it across the Öresund Bridge, right? So, so these types of examples exist quite widely. Yeah? But what is very important is the EU doesn't know this, right?
They are aware of that. The problem is that also we have only, say, Siemens, Alstom nowadays, or the big producers. It's very similar to aviation systems. But that is the aircraft once authorized, so it could run or fly globally. This is not the case because there's for rail, because you have so many little differences, even in the Czech Republic, or even maybe in central Bohemia in Praha, that not every single rail car can operate on every line. You have to somehow modify it, and also for Siemens, for these global producers, they have like a packages. So it means if you want to buy this Vectron locomotive, you can get it for Denmark, for Germany, for Belgium, I don't know, for the Netherlands, whatever. So this is one package where naturally this locomotive could run around. Then you have the Central Europe and the Southeastern Europe. And if you ask, for the Southeastern Europe, you would like to start the service from, let's say, Bucharest or from Istanbul to Denmark, it's so incredibly expensive to make all the modifications. It's almost impossible to make it because of so many different, unless the ETCS is here, the European air signaling system, but there are subversions of that. So,
but let's go down one level, right? If we could essentially find a way that the EU could make sure that any rolling stock bought by an operator can at least run across that border that it's next to, as at least the start, at least with the kind of standard technical installation to make sure that at least the electrification systems would be installed to run on the other side of the border. Right now, but what I would like, so learning from a completely different example, right? Now, the EU, through the Eurozone crisis, did lots of naming and shaming. It basically said, hey, country here, your budget deficit is too high, or you need to reform your pension system. Now, the EU, how much power did the EU have to reform the pension system? Not much, right? But it could make countries feel quite uncomfortable by saying, hey, you've got a deficit which is too big. Now, what I would like from the EU then would be an annual cross-border railway index that basically says at every single cross is it to reaching its potential, and what has got better or worse in the last 12 months.
How do you measure the potential?
No, so
I mean, because this is something what could be train kilometers, how many passengers live in a concrete area, what is the mobility pattern, whatever. I mean, this is something what is. I've been really involved in many such studies, and I agree with you. It would be good to have an overview of what is going on here and there. On the other hand, you can get some very strange outputs, and then you me as a clerk being in this, spend a huge amount of money explaining what this or that is not possible because of.
Right, but
sometimes,
or is a line applied, right? But crazy cuts in railway service as a result of coronavirus that have never been reinstated, right? I was walking across the border from Latvia to Lithuania with other passengers inside because they cut the service due to COVID and didn't just run it to the first station on the other side, right? Now, the Nibel to Turnhout, that strikes me, it is a line that has reached pretty much its potential. It's a single track diesel line with no passing loops and runs through an empty area. And it has 1 train per hour, right? I don't think you can do any more of that. And you basically go, it requires reward people, right? What's one of the best increases in international transport by train in the last 12 months or the last calendar year? It was Miskolc in Hungary to Košice in Slovakia. It went from 1 train per day to 7 trains per day on that route, right? Intercity services, right? It's like, good. There's a positive step forward here, right? I welcome this, right? So it's not only saying, hey, this is bad, we need to improve it, but actually saying, we're really grateful that this is improving and going in the right direction, right? Now, in my experience and talking to Adina Valian, the Commissioner for Transport, and Karima Deli, who is the member of the European Parliament who's chair of the Transport Committee, they have no practical idea of what is getting better or getting worse in cross-border rail, right? And they ought to have a better practical understanding. Now, that is then their officials that would need to basically say, hey, look, we see that because of Corona, or because, I don't know, a track broke down, right, a bridge collapsed or something, this got worse and we have a problem there. What are we going to do as the European Union to make sure it gets fixed? Yeah? And I want it to be practical. Yeah? There's a question here, however.
Yes, back to your project, you are basically after low-hanging fruits. And what such fruit project you are? What could we do was the easiest to improve our situation?
It's hard, right? So there's one which would make sense, which would be Warnsdorf to Seifernersdorf, right? Which is a small route then to Sachsen, where to potentially fix. One that I was debating whether there'd be a way, but again, it's more a Germany one to fix, would be finding a way of extending the Dresden S-Bahn, of whether you could extend it to Decin. But the question is whether there's adequate capacity in order to manage to do that, bearing in mind that until a tunnel is built.
It's not that problem. The problem is once again rolling stock.
Stop. And neither side has an electric train that can do it.
Exactly, because there's a different voltage system, and this is something who will pay for that.
Yeah.
Because if once invested, I mean, we have to still wait. I mean, somebody has to pay for that.
Right.
And this is always the problem of the money.
Yeah. So, but again, it should be one which logically, right, considering the density of population on both sides of that border, it's medium complexity to solve, I would say, right? So others, I would like a slightly better timetable at Bayerisch Eisenstein, right? But it's only a route from a small route through Bavaria. The trains are more regular on the Bavarian side than they are on the Czech side, but the area is more densely populated on the German side than on the Czech side. I'm thinking around all of the different routes. And I haven't been there yet to the border of Czechia to Slovakia, so I haven't got a ready project for you there. Obviously, there's the ongoing nightmare, which is Pilsen to Munich and Nuremberg, but that's mostly the German side because you guys in Czechia are getting your stuff in order, and the German side isn't. Yeah, so I can't lay a finger of blame on the Czech side for that one, honestly. So those are the ones at the moment I can think of, but they're not super major. There might be others because I haven't checked every single line, and there might be a few more towards Saxony on the kind of northwestern border of Czechia where you might say there'd be an opportunity to reactivate something. Do you know some others? Yeah. Somewhere where there's like something where Trilex or something could be involved in reopening a line. But again, it would be really, what you say in German, a Nebenbahn, like a branch line, basically.
Actually, I have an idea. I mean, one of the conclusions from your project, which would definitely help, I mean, is that it's not about, let's say you mentioned Chile now about Einstein.
Yeah.
The thing is that it's not about the railway, but once again about the politicians.
Yeah.
Who order, let's say the regional authorities, who order these public services.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what we have seen recently, Kozinski Kreis simply decided to, because it's their, they are allowed to do that because their rights ended exactly at the border. But these two tenders for the Czech territory and for the German Bavarian territory, they are no more combined there, so completely managed separately. And for this reason, there is no through train proposed for the upcoming years, because simply everybody has its own contract, its own rolling stock, its own rules. And if this should be changed and improve the regional lines to be more, let's say, through going, so this, let's say, communication on the political level would definitely help.
Okay. What I would say is, I obviously in all those cases really love a through train, right? That's the best. But if you can't get a through train, then at least make sure that the train that arrives at the border station has a timetable that works comparatively well with the one that leaves from the border station. Yeah? And Bayerisch Eisenstein is by far from being the worst, right? Bardonecchia Modane is much worse, right? And or Irun Andai, right, are much, much worse. And indeed, they're even much more densely populated places with much better infrastructure. Right? That is a single track diesel line.
But this is still the same problem, because if there is let's say the hub, the regional capital, so people think about the territory around the regional capital and within the borders of their competences. And if there is the Spanish part on that side, they do the same. For that reason, there's this border. So unless these two don't talk to each other, that it should be good to have a through connection. No chance to be really improved. Of course, sometimes the railway undertakings get the feeling because they see the figures. So they see, okay, they can see that there's a potential. They can then talk to both authorities to make some, let's say, arrangements. But mostly the politicians and the PSO authorities should understand.
But how much genuinely, though, do our politicians really understand those types of problems? So I talked to a Spanish member of the European Parliament from the socialist group in the European Parliament about the Zaragoza-Canfranc connection. And she's from Zaragoza, which is at the end of that cross-border line that doesn't work. And I had to explain the practicalities of why the line is not running. Right now, I don't know whether shocked is the right word for it, maybe disappointed would be more the correct word. To basically say, look, get together and understand the practicalities of the problem on the ground. Right? Now, what's the most optimistic situation from all of this project I've done so far? It is exactly the place where the politics works. It is Tornio to Haparanda in the northern Sweden and northern Finland, because both sides have a really collaborative political relationship. Now, I'm not really convinced much is ever going to run there, because the areas are too sparsely populated, so the traffic potential is quite low, but the political incentive is very strong. So how do you demonstrate this point to political decision makers? Now, I'm doing my best with this project to basically try and do exactly that, and basically say, look, Here is a simple, straightforward, practical solution to this problem. How you would go about solving it and try and build political will. It's ultimately a political project, not a transport a political transport project, right? Because I'm a political person and a communications person, not a rail operation person. Yeah. But I don't think we really disagree about the nature of the problem. Further questions, and then we'll draw it to a close because also actually I've got more than an hour, but anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Very annoying one. So have you talked to this timetable on booking sites? Or are they like mostly startups or what they are? Because sorry, like one big weakness that we have in the EU, and you keep saying EU, UIC, blah blah blah, is that we don't have like big tech companies, right? We don't have Facebook, we don't have Google, and I think these could make difference in this sector because they want to have this level of power, they want to provide the service. So have you talked to them, or what's the situation there?
So the one I've spoken to most is the Berlin-based multimodal travel planner Omeo. Used to be Go Euro, and it also acquired Rome to Rio. I know a bunch of people who used to work for Trainline, but now no longer do. And I know the people who built a London startup, Loco2, which then got bought up by SNCF and became Rail Europe. So those people I know. Yeah? I have not spoken to Google or other big tech companies in the sector. I do, however, know, based on trying to make this project work, is trying to get public transport data out of Google is a massively varying experience, right? In some countries it works really flawlessly, and in other places it's a complete catastrophe.
I guess that Google has like their own way of dealing with this. They demand their own format data. So either you cooperate with them or not, but they don't try to really integrate with this, let's call legacy systems.
So they will use, as far as I understand it, they will use TAP-TSI, right, which is a EU mandated standardized data format. But the problem is much of our rail plans, basically everything that powers Deutsche Bahn Reiseauskunft, probably powers MUVLAC in České dráhy as well, powers ÖBB, Scotty, and SBB, is all based on UIC merits data, right? Whereas Google's rail travel is not based on UIC data, UIC merits data. So, to me, how can I put it in an adequate way? Google doesn't really see a very strong financial incentive to solving this for rail. Why would they, right? They'll do what they can within the realms of what they can do. And the companies that could solve it don't have access to the necessary data to necessarily want to fix it.
If I can have
go for it.
For example, so there's this, Seznam Cesar, which is like a multimedia company in Czech Republic with fairly strong position. And I used to work there actually, so I have a little bit.
Yeah.
But anyway, they decided, they would like to do this public transport timetables. And they managed to apply some level of pressure on this previously very close system. So you mentioned the EOS, which is kind of like a golden egg for some media companies as well. It's a bit complicated, but so they managed to apply some pressure and got somewhere and got some data fairly consistent for the country. So, I'm really wondering if this lack of strong tech companies is for watching us. There will be like many of them. I know everyone likes to do Facebook.
But I asked Omeo, right, which probably few of you, particularly if you're railway people, have ever used, right? Because it's very hard to find the right trains in Omeo's search. Omeo's got something like, give or take, 150 employees in Berlin, something like that, right? It's a reasonably large operation. But part of the reason, in terms of my interpretation of why they can't push, right, for better access to the data, is they fear what, particularly in Germany, Deutsche Bahn would do to them if they did push too hard. Right? Indeed, they've actually just won a case with the Bundeskartellamt to get Deutsche Bahn to release more of the data. To me, there is there's another organisation which is actually starting to make some change in this area called EU Travel Tech. It's basically a trade association of all of the big travel booking platforms, but not only in rail, right? So Amadeus is one of the main driving forces behind it. And they are pushing that this needs to be better sorted out at EU level. Now, the problem would then be, and I don't know the answers, I've never got an answer from the European Commission, is how the EU, or if the EU, could place a legal obligation on UIC to make sure that UIC merits data was complete. But at the moment, I made the trains in the database. They basically want to answer you the question, I'm a clueless American tourist in Milan and I want to get to Venice, or I want to get to Vienna. Now, what instead I would like an organisation to do is build a genuine Skyscanner for rail, like in the early days. Right? Now, in the early days of Skyscanner, it would tell you there is a flight from London Stansted to Warsaw. We can't book it for you, and I didn't say it in these terms, so we can't sell it to you because Ryanair won't give us the data, but we will happily tell you that it exists. Right? Now, then eventually Ryanair gave them the data. Right? Now, basically a railway booking site that acknowledged the shortcomings of the data that they've got. And there are none of the current tech companies that have been willing to do that. To basically say, to shortcut to do what we all do if we're trying to book an international railway ticket, but turn that into a product to say, there is at the Iran-Ondai border Euskotren that will get you across the border. We can't sell you a ticket for it, but we suggest you go that way. Right? No railway booking platform I've yet encountered has that attitude. And basically says, we're going to make the best of the data that we've got. There is one data thing I'll explain to you over a coffee, however, which I can't say on the YouTube film, but I've got a good example which I'll tell you. Yeah. Right, let's stop there and have a glass of water or something. Thank you, and then I'll stop the stream. I hope if you wait, let me just check. Oh, my computer's gone to sleep. I don't know whether there are then people who've been posing me questions on Twitter and I've just been too busy talking and haven't noticed them. Anyway, have a cup of coffee, folks, or a glass of water, and I'm just going to check.
Some food as well.
Do some food, just check to see if there is. Oh. Portugal has decided it's going to put on a new train to Bariloche. Incredible. No, there are no questions. Oh, that's fine. Okay.
Good luck, I have to go. So.
Okay, well, yeah, and keep up the pressure on EU decision makers as far as you can, right? I'm doing my best towards the German ones, but